With the new season of Andor just around the corner, I thought now would be the perfect time to finally add a Shoretrooper helmet to my collection. The file that I'm using is broken down into pieces similar to how the original helmets were made. I'm using ASA for my helmet because of its post-processing benefits. It's nearly identical to ABS, I just had some of this beige ASA left over and it was a reasonably similar color to the Shoretrooper color, so I thought I'd just use it. It's by Polymaker and it's the color Natural for anyone interested. I'll link it below as well as anything else important mentioned in this video, but this stuff prints so smoothly. The layer lines just melt into each other, and I've never had a particularly difficult time printing with it like I have with some other types and colors of ASA. The only caveat, of course, with using ABS and ASA is that you do need an enclosed machine, and ideally one that has chamber heating as well, which is why I went with using the Bamboo Lab H2D this time. It's one of the machines I'm trying to get more hours on to test it out more thoroughly, and it checked all of my requirements. You know, it was big enough for all of the pieces, it is an enclosed printer, and it also has chamber heating. And you know, the fact that it has been printing these ASA pieces so beautifully and cleanly is also a nice bonus. I waited until I got all of the pieces printed before starting to remove any of the support material. These were all fairly complex shapes, so the majority of them did need support material to be able to print successfully. The nice thing is that because it is ASA, it means that I can recycle all of this extra filament into an acetone slurry to help smooth these parts out later. The supports were all coming off pretty easily, not much effort on my part. I did still end up using some pliers here and there just for more trickier areas that I couldn't really get a good grip on. This time around, I didn't just feel like sticking to a helmet for this build, and found this incredible model that's technically a helmet stand, but it's really to turn your helmet into a full life-size bust. This was printed in some black ABS, again, incredibly smooth and just a very impressive looking 3D print. I'm starting off the post-processing by mixing up some of that acetone slurry I mentioned earlier. All of this is some acetone that I put into a small glass jar so that I can always have some of this on hand, and I cut up small pieces of ASA or ABS support material to add into it. The acetone will dissolve the filament into the mixture, but I never overdo it with how much filament that I actually add into it. I find that if you add too much, it will turn into this gloop that will just like never dry and always remain like sticky. So I would say the consistency is that of more like a thick water, and just having this mixture have a bit of a color so that you can see where it's being applied onto your pieces is what is almost the most helpful. Because ultimately when you are scrubbing this and applying it to the surface, you are activating the filament that you're applying it to, so that also mixes into the acetone to help smooth the piece. Normally I like to apply the acetone slurry onto all of the parts first because it saves me having to do an extra sanding step. You know, instead of sand, slurry, and then sand again, I just do slurry and then sand the one time. But the only part that I applied any of the slurry to was that dome piece. The rest of them were looking really good, so I just went right in with the sanding, of course using the foot sander. You know that I would never be without this thing, and I always spend a decent amount of time with this first initial sand. It is the easiest it will ever be to sand because of being able to use the foot sander directly on it, and also the ASA sands so much easier than when I start applying anything else to it. So spend some extra time on that first sand, you will thank yourself later. While I was sanding the various parts, there were a couple spots I noticed that I figured would do well with some of the slurry applied, so I went ahead and touched up those areas, let them dry, and then finished the sanding of any of those parts, as well as the dome that I hadn't actually touched yet in terms of sanding. I do mostly rely on the foot sander for this initial sand, but I do still end up going in with some generally 180 grit sandpaper into any of the smaller, harder to reach areas where the foot sander can't really get into. From there, I decided to start assembling this helmet. Now, because again, this is ASA, I get to chemically weld these parts together and not just use an adhesive. And for this, I went with some methyl ethyl ketone, or MEK. It's kind of like acetone on steroids. It ends up reacting to the ABS or ASA a lot quicker than I find acetone does. It really starts to dissolve like pretty immediately. I also find that it evaporates quicker, which means the parts like solidify faster, so it ends up being great when you are assembling parts together. And I really slap this stuff on. I mean, it does evaporate so fast that if you don't like drench your pieces, it will just like not react to the filament at all. And I end up applying it to both sides of whatever I'm assembling, just so that that it can start reacting to the filament and make it nice and sticky so that the part's like staying in place. I used some clips to keep the face piece aligned and wanted to let that sit before attaching the dome. So while I was waiting, I decided to move on to the bust piece. Because this was a single piece all built in and had quite a lot of detail, I knew it was going to be a kind of nightmare to sand, and I wanted to sand it as little as possible, so I just went straight in with the MEK and just slathered it all over this thing to try and smooth it all out, like make it all melt together so that I really wouldn't have to do much sanding on it. This was already a really clean, smooth looking print, and I kind of just wanted to experiment to see how little I could get away with in terms of post-processing to get this to the smoothness point that I always would want it to be at. Once I'd finished smoothing that all out, I then went back to working on the helmet and putting the final piece on, which was the top dome part. There's also this inner visor piece that I ended up printing in black ABS that I didn't film attaching because there was just like no good way of me showing you it with my hands just all up in the helmet. You can also see that from using the MEK on this helmet, there were some splashes and some other areas of just general meltiness from applying it so much, so I did go ahead and sand this down once again. I know this is a lot of sanding before putting any amount of paint on this helmet, but believe me, it ends up being worth it in the end. But now it is time to finally start putting some filler primer onto this helmet. I'm going with this Rust-Oleum type. I don't really have a preference. I typically just buy whatever I can get cheaper at the time, and I've built up a pretty decent stockpile of a few types. I did specifically grab this type though this time around because it has a lower temperature usage recommendation, and when I was working on this helmet I had like 2 days of warm weather, and by warm I mean like 10 degrees Celsius, so that might be a bit of a stretch to call it warm. And it's also normally the low end of the range that spray paints recommend you use them at. So yeah, thankfully everything went well this time around and I didn't have any weird drying or reaction issues because of the colder temperature. And while I was waiting for that first coat of filler primer to dry, I went back to the bust and started sanding that. And once that was all sanded down, I then went and applied some filler primer to that as well. And I do just want to mention that anytime you see me do a round of filler primer, I always do 2 coats. So whether you actually see footage of me doing the 2 coats, it happens all of the time regardless. I do actually this time have proof of me doing the second coat of filler primer on the helmet because I had to make sure that I was getting into all of the lower nooks and crannies because I just didn't do that the first time around. Once the second coat of filler primer had been applied and dried, I did decide to add a bit of spot putty. I honestly didn't think I was going to be adding very much because looking at this helmet like just fully primed, it was looking pretty great and there were really only a few small areas that needed touch-ups, which is why I didn't end up filming it because I thought they were going to be small areas, and really it was only the top of the upper brim and the top of the dome, which are typically the more problematic areas. But other than that, I just took some 180 grit sandpaper and went over this entire helmet because again, this was looking really, really good. And from there added another couple layers of filler primer just to make sure that everything was looking as smooth as I wanted it to be. At some point during all of this, I went ahead and printed the few small greebly parts in resin just so that they captured all of that lovely detail and also so that I didn't have to do any post-processing on these really. All I did was hit it with a bit of filler primer and called it a day. Didn't sand it, didn't do anything. The filler primer was mostly just to make sure that like they looked absolutely flawless in case there were any little printing imperfections. Once all of the filler primer had dried on the parts, it was time to paint them black. Now, if you've ever seen me filler prime and paint anything, then you're probably used to seeing me do a final sand of like a 400 grit before I then go ahead and start painting this in any color, but not this time around because Shoretroopers actually have a decent amount of texture on the helmet. I will talk a bit more about this in a minute, but because it was going to end up having this texture, I wasn't going to waste my time doing like a super smooth sanding job onto this, and even then, this helmet was still looking incredibly smooth. Like this is what it looked like after that black primer. I absolutely should have done multiple coats of the black primer though because of the paint chipping that we're going to be doing to this helmet, and technically also to the bust. But yeah, apparently I just got a perfect single coat laid down on this black, so I didn't feel the need to do a second round, which I should have. Once the black had dried, it was on to masking. Now for the bust, it was mostly masking the undersuit, and while this is technically black, this was mostly masking to stop this area from gaining any of the texture from the beige paint that we're going to be adding. And same idea for the helmet, I masked off any of the larger areas that I knew were going to end up being black. For any of the smaller recessed areas, I just could not be bothered, and I knew I could easily hand paint them later, so I didn't mask those. But then it was on to adding some paint chipping with some masking fluid. I used my tape ball method for this, which is literally just a crumpled up piece of masking tape or tin foil, anything that stays more rigid. I then dab that into some masking fluid and then apply that to any areas to give it a really natural chipping weathering effect. Once the masking fluid's dried, we can move on to the paint, and for this I am using the Montana Gold Sahara Beige, which is apparently the screen accurate color. And I just happen to have an entire case unused left over from the battle droid, so I was not going to complain about finally having a use for it. Now the thing that I have briefly mentioned is that this helmet has a bit of a texture, and I swear it is because of this paint, because if you have ever used this paint color or any of the lighter white based Montana Gold colors, if you don't shake it up for at least a solid 5 minutes or just incredibly thoroughly, it comes out very dry and grainy and creates a very sandy texture, which is exactly what this helmet ends up having. So whether it was done on purpose or it was just sort of what they had to work with because of this paint, who knows, but regardless, it does have a bit of that texture, so if you want to recreate that texture, just buy this paint and don't shake it up super well or do a few coats of it, and you will apparently end up with the perfect screen accurate texture. Once the beige paint had dried, I went ahead and removed all of the masking tape, and I'm going to start with finishing up the bust first. I decided I wanted mine to look like a squad leader, and they are the ones with the blue stripe across the chest. So I went ahead and masked that off, did some eyeballing and then some more precise measuring to make sure that the tape was actually level on it. For the blue, I used a mixture of these two paints because I felt that the Tamiya color on its own was a bit too dark and muted. And I also decided to just apply this with a brush. It ends up being quite scuffed off, so this not being an absolutely perfect application wasn't going to be bothering me. I also didn't really feel like having to mask more off if I decided to use an airbrush for this. Also on the bust, I used some of this semi-gloss black on the neck seal. It's visibly more shiny than the rest of the undersuit. So in the name of trying to have this look as realistic and texture accurate as possible, I went ahead and painted that, which was honestly a very simple step to take. I did apply a second coat of the blue just to make sure it was a nice solid color, and once that had dried, removed the tape. Now it's on to weathering. I'm going to start by using this Scotch-Brite pad and this stainless steel scrubber to scrub across this entire bust to give it some actual scratches and paint chipping. I will also use some pretty gritty sandpaper, but I find that these two give a slightly more realistic effect, or at least a little bit more of a subtle one. From there, I went in with a mixture of some black and brown acrylic paint. I used a variety of techniques with this. Sometimes I was more dry brushing it into the recesses. Then I switched to using a more watered down mixture like a wash and blotted that into areas where I knew dirt and gunk would build up. Just trying to build up a nice realistic and lived-in depth to the piece. With Shoretroopers, I feel like you can get away with some pretty extreme weathering, especially because the paint chipping is black. It's a really stark contrast, and so having the dirt be built up quite dark in those recesses doesn't look unrealistic. But as always, I do like to go in and gradually build this up in layers as to not accidentally overdo it. I then repeated a very similar set of steps for the helmet, starting by scuffing up the entire thing with the various types of scrubbers and scouring pads. This is also how I like to remove the masking fluid, and also where I could start to see that it would have been a good idea had I done more layers of the black paint, because I was scuffing this basically down to the gray primer, but all I did was paint over any of the areas that looked too gray for my liking. It wasn't the biggest deal, it was easily fixable. It obviously would have been great had it been the right color that was showing up underneath all of the paint chipping, but it was a reasonably easy fix. Next was on to the flat black details. I somehow missed that this upper band part was supposed to be black. I probably would have masked it off had I realized that sooner, but again, not a big deal. We can just hand paint that. Mostly I was focusing on painting any of the recess details. So this button on the ear caps, this lower tusk recessed area, there's two on each side, the recessed bars on the back of the helmet, and then of course all of those back vent stripes. Underneath the upper brow of the helmet, there is this recessed area that also needs to be painted black. And then back to using the semi-gloss black, I applied this to the visor ridge, brim, under eye bags. I've seen this called, this area around where the visor will end up going. It always appears to be glossier than the rest of the areas on the helmet, so that's why I went with the semi-gloss black. Same thing with the trim on the blast shield. It always appears to be shinier or glossier than the other black areas on the helmet. Before continuing on with the weathering, I wanted to first install the greeblies just in case any of the paint would naturally end up on them. You know, I wanted to make sure that they didn't look overly clean compared to the rest of the helmet if that was something that was going to happen. Same thing with the blast shield. I wanted to make sure that this was installed so that any of the weathering would match up across the whole helmet. This time around for weathering, I decided to go with my dirty paint water in an airbrush technique, which is just the airbrushing version of what I was doing with the acrylic paint black wash that I was applying with a brush on the bust part. I just find that using an airbrush makes this process so much easier, and I just generally like the look of it more. You never run the risk of accidentally ending up with visible brush strokes anywhere. The one thing with this though that I definitely wanted to mention is if you end up giving your helmet a lot of texture, probably don't do this, because from weathering the battle droid and where I had areas that the Sahara beige had really clumped up on and had been very gritty, it was nearly impossible to remove any of the black wash from. So unless you want your helmet to be dark brown, just if you do this, do it very sparingly, or maybe just stick with the brush just so you don't run the risk of your helmet becoming so unnaturally dark because you just can't blot the paint out of all of the little texture crevices. Before moving on with the weathering, I wanted to add the symbol to this blast shield, and I also wanted to show you how I ended up scaling it appropriately. The measurement of this side edge on my helmet was a pretty even 30 millimeters, so I drew a line digitally and then scaled up this photo to match. I then went ahead and drew a line across the symbol, which ended up being a pretty even 27 millimeters, so that's the size I went with. I will link below the PNG file for you to turn this into a stencil yourself if you want, but scaled this down in Bamboo Suite so that we could get it digitally cut so it was nice and perfect. I have to say it's very nice to be able to place a sheet randomly on the build plate and then just line up the image wherever it is and have it cut out, which took all of 5 seconds, I think that was. And this is cut out of some stencil vinyl. I also use the same digital measuring technique to figure out the distance from the sides of the blast shield to figure out where exactly this stencil needed to be placed, and that was about 10 millimeters either way. The other thing is the angle of this design, and the straight lines line up with the straight lines on the helmet, so you are going to want to have the blast shield installed on the helmet to figure out the appropriate angle for this to be placed at. And for this we're going to need a more orange tone red. I had these two because I wasn't sure exactly which one I would like more, so I kind of used a little bit of a mixture of both, and I airbrushed this on pretty dry just to not have any of the paint hopefully bleed underneath the stencil, which thankfully it did not. This was one of my better stencil jobs. Now continuing on with the weathering, I used the same black and brown acrylic paint mixture like I used on the base to deepen up some of the recessed areas where I felt like the wash didn't quite darken enough, and just in general add some more depth and texture to areas. So I did go into a lot of the recessed zones, but then I also sort of dry brushed it across and just tried to build up a bit more texture to look like it was more naturally weathered. I had about 15 reference photos of various Shoretrooper helmets on my TV screen behind me that I was looking at, and I can tell you there is quite a variance in levels of weathering on various stormtroopers depending on, I guess, how much battle they have seen. So this was not the most weathered I could have gone, but I wanted mine to look like, there had been some battle, but he didn't barely make it out. The last thing this helmet needs is a visor. This is just a piece of welding visor that I heated up with a heat gun and formed it and shaped it to fit into this helmet really well. It's one of those things that's really hard to film because my arms are fully up in the helmet and you'd basically not be able to see anything, and I'm just hot gluing this into place. It just so happened that the helmet stand poles I designed a couple of weeks ago fit nearly perfectly into this helmet stand, so I used a couple of extras that I had laying around. I did hot glue this into place because it was a little loose, but it was still a decent enough fit and also really convenient, and then I could pick whatever helmet top that I wanted to go on it. And here is my finished Shoretrooper bust. I think I might have accidentally unlocked a bit of a new obsession with making these trooper busts, so please let me know if you would like to see more of them, and if so, which troopers you would like to see them of. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video.